that half an hour.
Every time something breaks, you learn another thing once you fix it. The problem is when something breaks and you never figure out how to fix it. And the fixing it could be 2 minutes. It could be half an hour. The times when you don't know how long it's going to be to fix it are the most frustrating.
I've developed a reflexive response to the phrasings of I've got this problem and I don't know how long it's going to take to fix it, because usually that's a contractor or a repairman of some sort explaining to me that this thing that I desperately want to be fixed is going to take a long time
or cost a lot of money, or both.
Well, yeah, for sure. And I don't know if you're a stand-up fan, but Sebastian Maniscalco has a really funny bit about that. Uh, we'll not get into that here.
So, and it's on what, Repair Guys?
No, it's his wife. It's called, probably the bit is Buff It Out or Car Repair.
So I don't do things to my cars that can be buffed out generally. the stuff I do to the car can never be buffed out. I checked yesterday. I don't know how long it had been, but I've confirmed that one of the cars still had oil in it to the level that it's supposed to be. You're supposed to check that every fill up. You're supposed to check and make sure it still has oil in it.
There are, my dad for my entire life preached that we had to change the oil in our vehicles every 3,000 miles.
Okay. Jiffy Lube also preached that.
Well, yeah, of course. It's a complete fabrication. Jiffy Lube, yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
Do you know Car Talk? You know that show?
Not really.
It was an NPR Saturday morning show, Click and Clack, the Tappet brothers. And somebody called them once. They've been off the air for a while, but somebody called them and they're like, my oil can't really be changed anymore. The plug is cross-threaded or damaged. There was something that made it so it was completely impossible to easily drain the oil, and there was going to be a very expensive repair job required. And their advice, this is an old car, their advice was, just don't change it. Just don't worry about it.
Write it out.
It'll be fine. Is it leaking? No. You should probably check it from time to time. Top it off if it gets low, but yeah, no, you don't need to swap it out. See what happens.
Well, I'm on year 2 of an electric car, and so I don't have to worry with those things anymore, but it brings its own set of challenges.
I will continue to take advantage for the foreseeable future of let's call it I would say there's waning interest in traditional internal combustion engines that are primarily a mechanical means of conveyance. The interest in what the app is that controls your phone, that is potentially a boon for me, because I do not want an app to control my phone. I don't care about an app to control my phone. And the cars I want are like $20,000. And I don't think I'm ever going to be able to get past the mental block of paying more than maybe like $25,000 for a car, which puts most electrics out of reach. The Nissan Leaf, I think, is the cheapest one right now at about like 26 or 27K.
Well, let me just say, if you intend to do mainly limited radius around your residence driving, do an electric car. If you intend to drive further than limited radius around your residence, stick with your gas.
I think people should get electric cars. I just don't think I should get an electric car.
Oh, well, that's ideologies of all sorts.
Well, so my reasoning here is that I know how to keep an internal combustion engine vehicle on the road, not necessarily doing the repairs myself, but the conversations I have. Like, I know what the systems are in the 2 cars that I own. I know each of the systems well enough to be able to quickly Google. They're both mass market vehicles, and I can Google how much should blah blah thing cost to repair, And I can quickly find out, is this something that I do it myself? Is it something that requires a mechanic? Is it something that requires a dealer? And obviously the things I hate the most are anything that's dealer specific, because then it's more obscure. I have one car from a less popular manufacturer and it's hard to get stuff made, or hard to get stuff done through their dealer network. I went to get a key that you can only get from the dealer, and they were like, you need a new clutch, and also your brakes are bad. And I was like, okay, how much is that going to be? Wait a second. I asked you to program me a key fob. Oh, well, we take a look at all the cars all the way around. You're telling me you incur additional expense for my benefit. I find that highly unlikely. Took it to another shop, independent place. They're like, we could replace the clutch for you, but it's fine. We'd be replacing parts that are fine. Do you still want us to do that? It's like, no, I don't.
I believe the term is upsell.
And they almost got away with it if it weren't for those meddling kids on the internet telling me to be wary.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it wild how that entire thing is just baked into a lot of our sort of transactional relationships in life? Whether I think it's just baked into it, and it's a little wild.
I think it comes from, as things become more complex and specialized, and like the chain, not the supply chain per se, but like the value chain gets stretched longer and longer and longer. Each person has a smaller, more specialized role to play. So what used to be, a debate between, do I have time to fix my brakes myself, or do I want to, go watch my kids play baseball, or do I want to fix my brakes this weekend? Now it's like the typical person simply doesn't know how to change the brakes, and so it's not a complete evaluation. It's just sort of like, what's the cheapest place to change my brakes, not should I do it myself or not.
Cheapest and fastest.
Yeah. Well, so across a large system, like, the speed of brake replacement is about the same almost everywhere. Like, it depends basically on how close are you to a city center, what kind of car you have to a degree. And basically it's like every shop within a certain amount of distance to major metro area, you're going to have exactly the same speed of brake repair across everybody you could get to do it, which is insane to me.
Yeah, I think the push is toward, especially for vehicles that are under warranty from that you purchase or lease from a dealership.
Right.
All of the warranty coverage hinges on you doing all services with that department.
With them.
Yeah. Yep. And that is not fast. That is an all-day affair, best case scenario.
Yeah, because once it's already paid for and out the door, like, there's the speed is not a factor anymore. Yeah. Because it's a captive sale. Did you grow up incrementally improving your car? So your first car was a piece of crap. It had a ton of miles on it. You had to search hard to find it. And then you got a slightly nicer piece of crap after that piece of crap wore out. I mean, did you go through that cycle?
It's interesting that you ask that, because I think that's my prism. We have, what we plan to talk about this entire week. That's my prism for all this is, and I don't like to belabor the point. There's a lot of this, sort of appropriation that I don't care for, but I grew up really poor. So yes, I've known crappy vehicles that have not gotten me where I've intended to go, that didn't have heat in the winter, those sorts of things. I
grew up not poor at all, and I still went through the same cycle, because I grew up where it's like, you're young, therefore you get whatever the worst vehicle is. Like, worst vehicle, none / beg, borrow, and steal a ride, had a lot of that. And then there was no assumption that there was a car for you, but when you did get a car, it was whatever the worst one was, and it wasn't yours. And then once you got into college, for example, that was like, okay, well, now there's a car that, you should take the money that you earned to go buy that car. I ended up getting a car bought for me. It was like $5,000 for my first car that was actually mine. And I my dad told me after a couple of years, he was like, you never paid me back for the car after I like bought it for you. I was at school and I bought the car at home, and he's like, you never paid me for it, but you don't have to. And I'm like, really? I could have sworn I paid you for the car.
Well, you had good parents. If they had the financial means, but still made you, have a lesson with a less expensive vehicle than you had good parents.
Well, I'm reaching early midlife, or my early late 30s, you could call it. And I just realized in the last couple of years that there are people I know who did not go through this cycle of you search for cars based on lowest price first, and then you're like, what doesn't have 3 million miles on it? And then you don't fix stuff on that car. You drive it until you can afford to fix the thing, or you drive it until you have to get towed, or you drive it until you have to get wrecked. You can't afford a tow, so it's more like drive it till it sits on the side of the road with a towel rolled up in the window. I mean, like, I thought that was a mostly universal experience for American 90s kids in suburbia, like between a certain band of income.
It's not.
Yeah, apparently not.
Yeah, and it's definitely different today too.
Kids don't want to drive now.
Kids don't want to drive, and well, and also vehicles, parents are, you can buy, it's like the Walmartization has hit automobiles as well. Like you can buy a new vehicle for $18,000. I mean, not a Ferrari, but you don't have to spend, granted, the scale of $3, $4, $5,000 when we were buying vehicles to,
yeah, that translates to like 14 or 15K now.
Yeah, so I mean, it's not that much different, but there's a lower entry point for a new vehicle today, respectively, that I think I would do it. I did do it. I have done it.
This is all very complicated because you have, so the math and the like the seat of pants math of what are you getting for your money is very complex, because there's the purchase price, then there's how long you expect that thing to last. There's uncertainty there. There is, is it safe? Is it nice? What other stuff does it have? How often will it need repairs? How much will those repairs cost? All this stuff gets really, really complicated to try and evaluate on the fly, and then comparing things to like the purchase price of new cars. The average purchase price of new cars in the United States has been on a sort of hockey stick trajectory where it gets more and more expensive every year. But that's the average purchase price, which is not particularly relevant to, say, a 16-year-old shopping for their first car, which is going to be used. And they may be getting a better deal than they ever have before, because the used car market for a car that costs between, today's dollars, $10,000 and $20,000, you've never been able to get a better car than today. Because you got a Toyota Camry for $12,000 with, 90,000 miles on it, you're going to get 10 years of good use out of it. Systems become complex, Terry. You see the segue here.
I do. It's interesting. That is, we wanted to talk about, I think this week, the theme, and really we could probably talk about this for a month, I feel like, is the competency crisis. And I guess the first sort of chunk we want to take out of that is a lot of really complex systems, power generation, manufacturing, a lot in heavy industry. We know these people. We've worked with these people in some capacity. There are a lot of those people at retirement age that are taking with them a lot of domain knowledge. And it's a real problem in terms of replacing that knowledge. And I have questions, like, we can get into some of that, but I have questions about, is it just the transfer of knowledge that is the problem? Is it just, Bob has been at, We Energy for 30 years, and he's got all these mechanical systems that he keeps running, and, he knows the entire process. Is it just that domain knowledge, or is there an ethos around, work ethic and that sort of thing? I don't know. I don't have the answer for it, but I wonder if it's just domain knowledge that is the problem with the retirement of folks that have done, sort of have been the gatekeepers of keeping these complex systems that we are crucial. I mean, anyway, we'll get into it, but that's my thought.
All right, so we're going to start with knowledge transfer and skilled labor skilled labor leaving. When you say so, let's put a couple boundaries on it. When you're talking about skilled labor, are you specifically talking about hands-on operations workers? Are you talking about anybody who has, meaningful domain expertise built up over a number of years? Meaning, could this also just be a designer or an executive or a manager who happens to know the industry and the people in the company really well?
Yeah, I think it's easier. Honestly, I think it's easier to replace executive knowledge than it is wrench turners. And wrench turners is not just necessarily mechanics or tool technicians, that sort of thing. It's production engineers.
Yeah, practitioners.
Yeah, practitioners, folks that understand how the systems need to operate to yield the output that that system is supposed to output.
I think it's easy to, so we can delineate here. I ought to have prepared a citation, but we're going to go with my proposal is we kind of delineate based on if your primary job function is not managerial, meaning anybody whose main job is to manage people in one capacity or another, or to manage a department, or to manage a division or a plant. We're generally not talking about that because we're assuming that knowledge is fairly transferable.
Right. And as is in the case of energy, it is always is the case. There are, this is the fuzzy line, and there are exceptions, and it's not a blanket application rule. But I think the folks who understand and manage the business transaction output of the system, whether it's a power plant, an oil refinery, a manufacturing facility. I think that, what are the prices that we need to get? What do costs need to be, are costs in line in terms of yielding the margins that we expect to get? That type of knowledge, I think, is very well understood and transferable as well.
Post-war corporate gigs.
Correct. And I think the closer you get to the process, I think, is what we're talking about. Whether that
here's a problem, because theoretically, the skills of an electrician or a PLC programmer or a CNC machinist, those are theoretically completely transferable generic skills.
But for sure,
theoretically, they are transferable skills.
For sure. But I think, and I've seen this, probably you have too, processes at that level, at the asset level, at the sort of incremental level.
Yep.
Processes fully depend on well-written programs, fully depend on it. Yes, turning on contacts and relays and that sort of thing is straightforward, but it's in the context. I've seen a lot of downtime because of bad programs.
So even if you say that, or if we say that 60% of things work well with generic skill, pick whatever the operational skill is, but this is hands-on, day-to-day, keep the plant running operations type work. Let's say 60% of that stuff is more or less on autopilot, and anybody can come in and solve it. That means that 40%, like if we assume 40% of it then is exception handling or unique circumstances or special cases, and then like even of that 40% being a little different, requires additional skills or specialized knowledge of that process as opposed to a process generally, where 90% of time is spent is on that last little bit. There's not even that 40%. This would be like the 5 or the 10% of the most complicated exception handling stuff. And that's where all the actual time goes, is into the stuff that is like the sticky stuff, or the really, really broken stuff, or the really, really important stuff. So all the stuff that's working great is just like time is not spent on the stuff that's working great.
I think it scales also with analog to digital. I think the more mechanical the system, the more folks today, just based on what we're talking about, have the capability to keep that thing running. I think that's changing, but I think the more digital, the more the more complex the program, the fewer people that are able to keep that program running or maintain that program.
All right. So a point on complexity, though, is the complexity is both increasing and decreasing at the same time, because, like, take the electric car example. An electric car mechanically is far, far less complex than an emission controlled internal combustion engine. So there are fewer tubes, there are fewer metal parts, there's less stuff that moves. Just objectively, electric motor versus gas motor, the electric car is less complex. But if you take that, free lunch of less complexity because of the electric drivetrain, and then you add systemic complexity, meaning now it's integrated to a phone, which is a system that the car maker doesn't control. It has a security system. It has additional cameras and sensing ability. It has autonomous self-driving. You can end up with a car that's way more complex, but has nothing to do with the fact that electric is or is not more or less complex than internal combustion. And the same thing happens in factory processes. You can dramatically simplify a process by demechanizing it.
I liked mechanicizing better.
Okay, we'll go with demechanizing. Here's my. I've been reading a bunch of sci-fi stuff lately. Here's what I'm picturing. People have in their mind that, like, stuff will be really complicated as technology gets better, and things will be things will be superficially and observably more complex and fancier and more streamlined. But what if instead, we get rid of there's no more F-35, and instead it's a whole bunch of $30 drones, and every single one of the $30 drones is 4 rotors and a tiny chip that's mass produced controlling the 4 rotors and a little bit of communication, and that's it. Like, it's basically trash. But so any individual piece of that system is now dramatically junkier than what we thought the fanciness was. It's not going to be like a super starship. It's going to be just the proliferation of, like, disposability instead of, like, the many orchestrated disposable components versus, bigger, better, faster, stronger, more robust and more durable components.
So it's interesting that you bring that up, because
the trashy future.
I thought about, and this is another topic week for us at some point, but talking about, like, future predictions. I've heard for years about distributed generation. Buildings will have their own gas power plants in the building, and you can sell back to the grid, and that hasn't materialized. And I wonder. I think we all understand conceptually the benefits in any system of decentralization.
Mm-hmm.
If I don't have one power plant that's powering a city, I can use a cleaner, portability, smaller. A lot of things have fully moved. Devices have moved that way. Medical devices have moved that way. A lot of things have gone that way. Do you get there with heavy industry? Do you get to modular power systems? And I think there are a lot of political and policy issues associated with those types of things too. But do you get away from, there are power sources that power the city and you purchase from the grid? Does manufacturing have, and the other thing, I'll stop after this, but the other
I have one more example after your other thing.
Yes, and that's what I was headed to. Is I've also heard for years that Magna and some of these contract manufacturers, Ford was just going to be a software developer, and there were going to be companies that built their cars for them. This was a thing that was
I'm with you.
A given. It was a given.
Yeah.
It was a given. But it's not. And then one last point on that, and this is, we talked about Rodney Brooks last week, but folks like him have talked about, Tesla's the most advanced car on the road. Their manufacturing facilities still use PLCs. And I think there's that concept of what things could be from a skill perspective, but then what it can be, what we actually have in the near term is, do we ever get there?
I edited a product announcement over the weekend, and one of the comments I put in was, are we sure that we want to say never use ladder logic? Are we sure? Because what happens when we build an abstraction layer? Like, we write an abstraction layer for a legacy control that is interfacing with the existing ladder, and all we did, we generated ladder, but we haven't uprooted the control system. We've left the existing brownfield, and we've just added another layer of control on top of it. Why trash ladder if ladder still has a role? Sure, for greenfield stuff and new things, let's take a strong stance and say no new ladder logic or no new PLCs. But why pick an enemy when we have no idea, and we have no idea how far off that future is going to be?
Yeah. So I think that's the question with, a circuitous route back to where we started. I think that's the question with the skill gap is, are there technological innovations that can bridge that gap in practice, not conceptually? Like, I think generative AI, I think large language models are one. If we're just talking about knowledge transfer, I think large language models are one. I think the whole metaverse thing, and there's, a very large industrial company globally that's bet heavily on the metaverse, which makes me chuckle. When the company who changed their name to Meta has abandoned the metaverse. But I think there are some technologies that maybe offer some promise, but do you bridge the skill gap, the retirement of folks with tribal knowledge? Do you bridge that with technology? Is it a policy issue to drive more people in to fill those roles? Like, what are some of the potential mediation or mitigation strategies for that?
I'm actually I'm a policy zealot on knowledge transfer. I have like a very aggressively and firmly held position that I feel like I'm more or less unwilling to yield on at all. But I also feel like it's so wishy-washy as to be a non-position. Because I want to ask you, like, when I hear about when you phrase this as competency crisis, obviously that's, crisis is loaded. It means that something bad is currently or will happen. I don't believe there's a crisis per se, other than the ongoing crisis that is all of humanity trying to solve humanity's problems, right? So that's not a point crisis. It's an existential, continuing situation. But like so I'll ask you: would you say that you are pessimistic about institutional knowledge transfer, or are you not pessimistic about it?
Um, I think that's why I left room for it to be more than knowledge transfer.
Yeah.
And I left room, because I'm a coward to say that I think it's other things. I think it's other things too. I think there's an ethos. I think there's a difference in ethos. And I don't know what generation to what generation, or maybe it's just over time. This is we've moved to this, but I think there's a difference in ethos of pride and excellence, and wanting to be excellent at what you do. And I think that is, again, those lines are fuzzy, and it's not like one generation is 100% that way and one generation is not that way. But I think there are things beyond knowledge transfer that are areas for concern, not just with skill. I think skill is what we're talking about first, because if we have problems with our power grid, we have real societal problems. And I think so much depends on a stable, price per kilowatt hour of electricity in terms of manufacturing and GDP and all the things that people don't think the first thing about.
Right.
I think are tied to, if we're going to have, fast food restaurants with competency issues, that's one thing. But we want to make sure that if you're going to err on the side of caution in industries like power generation and manufacturing, it's better to be alarmist early and fix it than maybe not take it seriously enough and then have real problems.
So
And I think I'm not pessimistic, but I think you don't have the leeway in critical infrastructure. You don't have the leeway to find out.
So I'm going to have a persistent refrain here through all of this discussion, and I don't see any way past it, which is going to be the difficulty in quantifying problem, quantifying, components of the problem, quantifying, the success of particular approaches. So the inability to actually specify things like kids today don't want to get their hands dirty. There is absolutely no way to scientifically evaluate that statement, and attempting to do so is a fool's errand. So that type of approach is going to be a nagging problem for me throughout. So I could say, yes, Terry, you're right. There was a culture of excellence that existed in period X, Y, or Z, but I have no way to actually defend that meaningfully,
Totally agree.
other than through a series of anecdotal evidence, which are also going to be subject to, like, availability bias for me and my recency bias, and just, it's storytelling, right? So, like, I can tell you whatever story I want about whatever period of time, and if, depending on what thing you pick, you could say, this is a great one. They don't make them like they used to. I would get, like, particularly, people that were, a decade and a half younger than me, coming into manufacturing, suddenly getting to, like, know the means of production, and they'd, marvel at stuff that was older, and they would think they were kind of like, they think they were sort of saying the right thing to me by being like, man, this old stuff that was always made so well, they just don't make it like that anymore, do they? And I'm like, wrong
Yeah.
guy to be kissing up to with that. Because the only stuff that made it that you're using to evaluate is the stuff that was good, right? Like, the best stuff made it to here, and now we're sitting in an antique shop with the good stuff, and all the trash is trash, right? Like, it went back into the earth, and that's only the first side. So the first side is the survivor bias of, you only get to measure the good stuff that made it through. The other side of it is the presumption that, like, durability was the only objective, and to prioritize durability over other things, as an example, right? But, like, if you touch it and it feels heavy and weighty, okay, well, fine. If it's heavy and weighty, but it's a thing that needs to be shipped far, well, those are huge costs. That's not a benefit. The fact that, like, you and I needed to carve our own wooden wagon wheels instead of using pneumatic tires was not a net gain to humanity or Earth, or either of our ability to be a craftsperson. It was done out of necessity, and it was objectively not better. Is it worse? I don't know, but it was not objectively better that we were all, like, individual craftsmen making everything heavy and strong and burly. Reducing, like, the wall thickness of some crummy plastic part. Am I happy that the wall thickness of crummy plastic parts is lower now than it was before? I mean, not necessarily, because all it's doing is propagating the number of crummy plastic parts. But there was a design requirement that was, this crummy plastic part needs to be, lighter, cheaper to ship, cheaper to make. We need to be able to produce more of them so more people can enjoy this crummy plastic part. And that was an intentional decision that got made about the design requirements and how it was specified. It was not an accident that it became, crummier over time. Going back to the drone swarm example, right? Like, choosing to have crummy drones versus F-35s is an active, intentional decision, not a fluke.
So what available metrics would one choose to evaluate whether or not there was a competency crisis looming in critical infrastructure? I say one, and I'm going to take the easy one,
Go
and
ahead.
then lob it over to you. I think you can look at the number of open jobs for the types of roles
Oh, I love this one
that we're talking about. And I think, I read this morning a Chamber of Commerce study, which,
U.S. Chamber.
U.S. Chamber of Commerce, that said that there are roughly 2 job openings for every 1 person that is available for that job. So I think the number was like 4 million people for 9 million jobs. And that feels like a fairly objective measure of, are people, these roles that we're talking about in critical infrastructure, are we filling those roles, or is that the plan? And I guess that's the discussion. Is it even a plan to refill those roles, or are they banking on technology to be able to eliminate some percentage of those jobs?
I have an inexcusably waffly response that is unhelpful to the jobs number. So the unfilled roles is quite easily quantifiable because there is a public record of open roles. These things are reported on a survey basis. There's a Census Bureau that collects this information. The Chamber of Commerce also collects this information. There are multiple sources. You can corroborate them against each other. So at its root, you can trust the type of statements like blah, 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 number of unfilled positions. So that is not, superficially a flawed number, right? Like, this is a number that you can believe. The problem is, it doesn't necessarily mean what it seems like it means. I've lived in the Washington D.C. suburbs for most of my life, and during a presidential inauguration, the Washington Post will routinely cite to the Craigslist short-term place to stay listings as evidence that there's number one, that there's not enough places to stay. Number two, there's a huge number of people that are going to come to town for an inauguration and a parade and all this stuff. But they don't cite to the number of people coming here. They cite to the price of a listing, right? So if I list my spare bedroom for $900 a night, so what? It's dangling a random number out there, particularly as I hear that there are more as I hear that there is demand. I have every incentive to put up a free ad for, my minimum amount of money that would take to have a stranger staying in my house. So there ought to be a proliferation of additional ads, right? The more you hear about it, the more there should be ads. So the number of ads is not actually a meaningful figure necessarily. It could be, but it's not necessarily a meaningful figure of the need so much as it is a measure of advertising and interest. So certainly it's a measure of, there is a lot of concern and interest about filling these positions. But the other side of that you have to take is, has there been upward pressure on wages? So for the unfilled positions, if you really needed more people to fill these jobs, you would pay more money. If instead this is a fishing expedition where it's cheap to post a listing, but not cheap to increase the pay, then you would have a proliferation of listings without a commensurate increase in wages. So that's my picking apart and deconstructionism, which gets us it provides no progress whatsoever on the actual issue.
Understanding what we're talking about?
No, none. All it does is pick apart and throw darts.
Well, that's a skill worth having in society today. So
you got another one? I don't think I have any that I can tear apart quite so systematically.
Overtime hours worked, and I think it would be hard to get that. Probably
that one's great.
Overtime hours worked in the industries that we're interested in evaluating, and I think some sort of algorithm of the two, open jobs and overtime work. I know that's an issue anecdotally. I know for a fact that's an issue anecdotally. Folks of the skilled, production skill, I say production manufacturing, that could be production of power, it could be production of whatever. The folks who know how to make that happen work a ton of hours. They're paid handsomely, but they also work a ton of hours. And I know just from my days in industry, when I'd actually be on a plant floor with these folks, that was a point of contention for them. Like, I'm on day 5, day 6 of 12-hour day, 14-hour day. And that's how a lot of accidents happen. That would be another metric we could probably evaluate. Number of recordable OSHA incidents, per hour worked, something like that. And these are, I just anticipate somebody who works in the space and looks at this as like saying, yeah, these are the common metrics we look at. We're not reinventing the wheel here, but I think there are things that we could certainly evaluate to see if the people who are there with the tribal knowledge are working more, a ton of hours, ton of overtime hours, that same place has open job listings, then
yeah, exactly.
Could back your way into some of that.
Yeah, and to cross reference to where you basically have a aggregate health index, right? Or an aggregate, it's things like age of average employee plus incidence plus overtime plus wage. So if there's if there's increasing wages at a place with old workers who also have a lot of or increasing amount of overtime, and they have recordable OSHA incidents, those are all indications that this place is concerned about losing skill, and they also have the beginnings of what they're doing about it, which is the upward pressure on wages, basically.
Well, and then the other thing you could do, the other evaluation or objective evaluation that one could make is, what's the average age of those positions 30 years ago, 50 years ago versus today? And that's probably not the best metric or the best evaluation, but you could see, is the workforce, is the skilled mechanical workforce, is the production workforce trending older? And if so, some of those other metrics could illuminate, is there an impending skill gap? Now, all of that doesn't take into account how much of that work that is or isn't being filled with manual labor,
Right.
or human capital, I should say. How much of that is being automated in software or in other, how much of that is being accounted for in technological advances? And I don't have the answer to that. I think that's what we've been promised. I think that's what Industry 4.0 has promised for a long time, comically. But I think that, just like distributed generation, I think we've been promised a lot of these efficiency gains in skilled production broad umbrella. And I don't know that that's materialized.
I think it's going to take, I don't think anyone will notice, right? Like it's not a thing that is fixed and you say, yesterday it was a problem, today it's not a problem. Similarly, it's not going to be last year it wasn't a problem, or it was a problem and this year it's not a problem. It's going to be, you would have to have held directly in front of your face, this is what it looked like in excruciating detail, not your memory of it, but the actual, this is what it looked like explicitly in year X or in decade X. And then you have to have that held up with the same stuff to your face. This is how it is now. And then you'd have a moment of saying, oh, I guess we have kind of come far on this, or I guess this is improving. But otherwise, the hunger to find the things that are still wrong and can be fixed is always going to be enough to make just general dissatisfaction in how things are now, which is that's the whole principle of why we do engineering, right? So it's not necessarily a problem to be hungry for the next thing to fix. And like I said before, we're always working in that hardest, smallest set of hardest problems taking the most time. So I think it'd be very, very, very difficult to evaluate, we've made, we've fixed it in the kind of way that I think the promise of Industry 4.0 and other hype reporting makes it seem like there's going to be this delineation.
Well, I think, and that's, I don't want to revisit or retrace our steps from last week, but I think that's the one thing with technology that frustrates me in industry, especially, is these things can be measured.
Yeah.
A company's profitability, if you're leveraging digital technology, if Industry 4.0, and it's comical to even use these labels, but if you're leveraging technology to improve operational efficiencies, you should be more profitable as a company.
Right.
From efficiency gains, not from cutting costs, not from cutting, not from, sort of the shell game and replacing costs from other places, but the improvement in how much power you consume, the improvement in scrap, the reduction of scrap, the improvement of quality of output, all of those things. And don't even get me started on OEE or, crap metrics like that, but all of the things that are directly measurable in terms of quality, um, consumption, using less product, getting more throughput, those sorts of things. Those should be illuminated highly if a company has embraced digital technologies to improve their efficiency.
I'm consistently surprised by how poorly that thesis that you just laid forth has been explored and reported on and capitalized on, because so I'm with you that all that stuff should be measurable and easy to improve, and yet you still don't see really like systemic evaluation of this stuff. You see, like there's a little bit of it going on, but overall, by the time you've gotten a consultancy to or a professor to have looked into this stuff and started to measure it, either the examples that they had that were the companies that doing it right have already crashed and burned because it turns out they weren't doing it right, or something changed, or this the market changed, or the things have moved on to the next thing that matters. So we're end up measuring stuff that was important for 5 years ago. So like I'll pick on GE because they're huge and famously had issues with Predix and GE Digital, right? So
I saw that. I saw those issues firsthand, by the way.
Yeah. Well, everyone did, right?
Yeah.
Like everybody anywhere in the industry saw that stuff, and that's why it's a poster child. But the gains that were made from those programs, which may or may not have justified the investment of those programs, but those gains actually were made, and systemic to all of GE, not exactly sustained, and had all the downsides that you see. But it's also possible that as GE Digital was unwinding, that there was some other thing happening somewhere else inside of GE that 5 years from now we're going to be look back and say, oh, these guys were geniuses because it turns out they were actually fixing this thing. Wow, we thought that they were just crashing and burning on that thing.
No, this is a tightly held belief of mine, and I've got empirical evidence, both personally and in work in the past, and that is one of those incidents. It all comes down to the things we talked about last week. It's the discipline of the reason why using less energy is even more important today than it was 5 years ago.
Yeah.
Companies, that's another topic of conversation, but companies are graded, on how much they can reduce their energy consumption. Plus, it's a huge It's a huge bottleneck in profitability. Is right. Fixed costs like energy and raw materials. So you want to use more. You want to use less of those. And the reason why we don't have companies trumpeting, this is my belief. They may exist. But the reason why we don't have companies trumpeting this is they can't get the math to make sense. And it's not a discipline. That's not a piece of software. It's not monitoring. You don't just have a data collection scheme and that's, right. We're doing it. Does the math, do the algorithms that you're training lead to an operational do different that is measurable? And that's the other part of it, is everything should be measured. That's one thing that I have worn as like my badge of honor in my professional work. Everything is measurable. Everything. And it should be. So if I'm putting machine learning inferences into a production environment in an enterprise, we're going to measure how many of those we believe are in the list that we're putting in and what's the dollar value of that list. Everything should be evaluated and measured based on a dollar amount.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think, I think it's simple. I think companies just aren't doing what they say they're doing. I think they're not, people are having a hard time. It's not their fault. I think vendors have promised things that they can't deliver on based on things that we talked about last week.
All right, so I have the answer. Kind of.
All right.
I have the answer to all of this. So first off, duality, right? You have to hold advancing technology and basic fundamentals of business operations and manufacturing and production operations. Both of those things have to be held in your mind simultaneously. So you can be terrible at technology adoption and phenomenally good at manufacturing production operations. Now, I don't think that will sustain forever. I think there will come a time and come a point where being capable at manufacturing operations has a digital component to it that cannot be avoided. For example,
that should be the case now. I mean, it should be the case now.
I think that, so
the tools are there.
I would say that the ubiquitous, like the ubiquity of digital tools has fully arrived in kind of back office operations. And I just don't see it being there in the plant floor. There are too many things that just don't exist with a better alternative than paper. And until that stuff keeps, like, it could be another 5 years, it could be another 15 years, but stuff that is obvious to any, technophile, it has institutional obstacles to being deployed in the factory floor. So
here's the number one objection. And this is, I'm glad you mentioned that, because this is like one of the main points that I wanted to make. So when I first got into the industrial world, I was in power plants and, whatever, doing what I was doing in power plants. And I saw, this was before I knew the first thing about data. I'd meet with these operators in coal-fired power plants or whatever, and they would have SCADA control package add-ons for their systems that were neural networks that would control to optimize for NOx or whatever they wanted to optimize for, would control replace the operator and control the whole process. Well, we were talking about knowledge transfer earlier. The limiting factor in the whole thing, even if the operator wanted to embrace it, is the neural network was controlling mechanical devices that were made for manual control or set it and forget it control from 30, 40 years ago, 20, 30 years ago. The resolution and the control of the neural network requires a more precise, more modern digital device to open dampers, to turn on fans, all of these things that control burner stoichiometry in a power plant. And so these guys would just bypass, they would bypass the neural network and just control it manually like they always had. And for me, that is one of the limiting factors for digital technologies in the production environment, is until these mechanical devices, which work fantastically, they work great, until they can be of a resolution to receive the sort of tight change inputs that an algorithm might provide, I don't think there's a lot of value, or there's questionable value for that.
And there's also there's an even worse middle ground that we have to fight. So a highly precise, highly effective manual mechanical system, call this from 1990 or before, or 1985 or before, something like that. That system may be objectively worse than a 2023 alternative, but it could also be objectively better than the 1993 computerized version of it. So you see this in CNC machine tools all the time. If you have a computer controlled machine tool that has maybe 256 megabytes of RAM and that's it, and it's using extraordinarily limited compute resources, but you're treating it like it's, you're not treating it like it's an edge device. It's not like this is a resource constrained, connector box. This is the freaking brains of the whole operation. And either because there's cost considerations, or because it's just sort of like inertia, or because there are architectural considerations, or it's, it's niche computing, so you end up with all the bloat of having a Windows-based control. There's all these different reasons why using 20-year-old computing techniques and hardware and equipment isn't going to go anywhere. So you end up with actually the worst of all worlds, where you don't have a system that's as good as an old mechanical, but you also have none of the real benefits of a digital system either. And that stuff, because it's stable and productive, is likely going to stick around for an extraordinarily long time. And can, like, basically the only thing that's going to upset it is either the hardware will break and have to be replaced, or someone will figure out a way to just rampantly cyber attack all this stuff. There'll be a massive rip and replace at some point.
Yeah, there are, and I say it's a fair point. I say a lot of these things from the sidelines. There are a lot of considerations to take into how you build things and how you make things, whether it's power or whatever. And it's a moving equation that's not easily solved. So there are digital tools, but I think a lot of things, and we talked about some of this last week. A lot of things, does the investment in infrastructure that would require for a manufacturing facility to upgrade to the types of equipment, production equipment that would allow them to be a digital factory, do the margins that they make, what's the ROI on that? And I think there are so many moving targets for manufacturers to consider to achieve the benefits of digital technology, which reinforces the skill gap discussion we were talking about earlier. I want to finish with this thought, and this is maybe a little tense, ideologically tense, but I think it's an important conversation. At least it is for me. We both read an article. Palladium magazine hedge fund manager wrote an article about the competency crisis in relation to hiring preferences and hiring strategies, and there was a racial component to that. And I thought, just on its face value, and you mentioned this earlier about jobs, but I thought on its face value, it was a bunch of things that can't be proven. There were no metrics. There were no metrics to say, and a lot of near miss, like airlines, air traffic, a lot of near misses. And that may be the case. Well, how about what are the numbers? How many near misses were there when it was the way you wanted it? And how many near misses are there now when it's not the way you want it? And I think I come at this, maybe it is the case. Maybe the case that the article that the gentleman laid out, people of skill are one race and they're getting, passed over or laid off or whatever. Maybe that's the case. I don't care. It doesn't matter to me. And I say that being, I think we should root for everybody. I think we should find ways we should want everybody to, we should want everyone to be skilled up. We should want everyone to have the skill and, to be promoted and to be great and to be excellent. If there's, if there are folks that, maybe have been overrepresented, and there are folks with equal skill, and I hate that whole conversation, because inevitably it's this position that no one can defend on metrics. It's all anecdote, and it's rife with envy and sort of, I think qualities that don't help society at large. I think we should be in the practice of rooting for everyone. And we should be in the practice of wanting everyone to have exceptional skill and wanting everyone to be technically amazing at what they do. Knowing that that's utopia and that's not the case, how do we move in that direction? How do we walk in that direction? And so I get tired of that part of the discussion. I think you can talk about skill gap in the crucial infrastructure, critical infrastructure of our country, how important it is to make sure if gaps can't be filled with technology, how important it is to fill those gaps with people. How do we do that? And I think that discussion should be on its merits and not, sort of with some of these fringe ideas.
I'd say that there's a lot of room for work to be done on pragmatic solutions to taming complexity and managing complexity. So I kind of debate whether there is a complexity crisis in the first place, and we can argue that more as we go. But I think let's just assume for a second that there is that the basic premises around a crisis in competency, that can be broken down into component problems, like where's the next generation workforce going to come from? That is an actual measurable problem that has actual meaningful trends that are taking place now that can be cited to things that are actually happening.
That's also, sorry to interrupt you, that's also a policy issue. We'll talk about that later in the week. That's also a policy issue. And that's an area where I think we can be better. But anyway.
I think that it's easy to create a culture war out of a, an opinion about how things were supposed to be. I think getting into what can we fix right now and what's a solvable problem now usually ends up sidestepping most of the culture war component. And I think that it's tempting because it's faster and cheaper to comment on, cultural aspects of this stuff than it is to go out and, find a panel of 20, 25-year-olds working in industry and just ask them what they say. That's a time consuming thing to do and a difficult thing to do. But if you do that, you're adding something meaningful to the discourse on this subject. If you just, surf the internet and make an internally coherent argument, maybe with anecdotal evidence and a limited citation of actual sources or statistics of any kind, and no primary research, you really haven't added anything to what needs to happen next. And I don't have a whole lot of room to spend time on that kind of stuff, really, because I think that it's a waste of everybody's time, and it's got this hallmark of culture war. So as we talk about crisis or competency, both of these being loaded, let's make sure that as we discuss it, we're talking about what needs to happen next and what could be, what are the actual things that ought to be contributed here, not observing a grand problem and then giving an extremely racially loaded and impractical, poorly researched position paper on why the problem here is that white people are getting beat up in the market. I think that's it's a tough position to actually defend.
And I don't. Yeah, I mean, okay. So if you're going to write that, and I have no problem with uncomfortable realities if their basis is in objective fact. Like if there are metrics, hard metrics, I have no problem with uncomfortable realities. I think we should be in the business of getting to the truth wherever that lies. Yeah. But an article like the one we read was just a bunch of anecdotes with no comparison, no statistical comparison. And I don't know. I just think I've had my fill of all that stuff. Like,
good.
I root for people generally. That's sort of that's the way I look at life. I don't look at any, I just root for people. I want everybody to succeed. I want everyone to live a life of purpose and meaning. And I'm not like, some unpragmatic utopist either. Like I understand that this is we move to entropy and it's a complex nonlinear system, but I root for people and I want everyone to succeed. And I can't imagine going through life, looking for how I can be wronged next, whatever side of that, I happen to come out on.
I'm a socio-technical optimist, which I can help explain next time.
That is too complex a term. I want to make a suggestion for you as we wind this down.
I'm all ears.
This is eye related. You need to be, you should consider, I'll offer that up as a suggestion. You should consider some complicated glasses.
Yeah, I actually, there's glasses all over this house. I'll bring some glasses in. You'll get glasses where you're talking about to make me look more sophisticated.
Well, yeah, all the smart cable news hosts, they all have complicated glasses, and I think I'm kind of doing my part. I think you should join me.
Didn't we start this whole thing by saying that the last thing on earth I want to be is another commentator?
No. So you can have some of the, you can have some of the, some of the juice, some of the props we can steal. But it's us just
stop slippery sloping me. Cite your sources. Anecdotes don't count. No, there is no culture war.
Stop slippery sloping me.
Don't do it.
Awesome. All right,
See you next time.
Have a good day.